Well, good morning, everyone. We're still letting people in to the webinar, but I want to welcome you to the Center for Ag Profitability's weekly webinar series. My name is Jessica Groskopf. I'm a regional extension economist with Nebraska Extension and the director of the Nebraska Women in Agriculture program. Today, I'm really excited to talk to you about not drowning in paperwork. And hopefully throughout today's session, we are able to get some lifesavers to help us manage the paper trail that we have that matches both our production and our financial records. So I think it's always good to start with a little bit of reality. And this is reality on our farm and ranch. My husband and I farm just north of Scottsbluff. And this was literally earlier this year. I opened his pickup to find receipts in his floorboard. And I think we've all had this moment where we need to track something down, we need to find something, and it never really made it to the farm or the ranch office. So today, I hope that we can find some opportunities to correct this or do better at it. And honestly, this is an improvement from where my husband and I started, but I had to give him a hard time about having a few receipts in his floorboard. So the question is, what are you drowning in? And all production record keeping systems and financial systems start with managing your paperwork. We can have software that does stuff for us, but there's still a paper trail that's associated with it. And we need a system to file that information fast so that we can find it easily when we need to access it. And what you will find is that there's no one size fits all solution for filing systems or for paper management systems that will fit all farms or ranches. And the other thing is that even within a given operation, family members will do things differently. So throughout today, we're going to be looking at lots of different opportunities, and I hope that you can just pull out one or two things to improve your system altogether. I know that a lot of us actually inherit filing systems, and sometimes you're really encouraged just to you get so frustrated that you just want to burn everything down and start all over. And unfortunately, sometimes that's not possible. So I really like this quote from Eric Tyler that says, "Start where you are, not where you wish you were." And I think this is very true if you are inheriting a filing system or a record keeping system, that sometimes you need to start with the components that you have and just work to improve those components. So to start off today's webinar, I'm actually going to go silent here for just a minute, and I want you to write down a paperwork related goal for your operation. So I'm going to be quiet, and if you would just grab a piece of scrap paper and write down that paperwork related goal. All right, well, thank you for doing that. So as we move through today's webinar, I think it's really important that we think about that paperwork related goal. Maybe it's getting all the receipts to the office, or maybe it's establishing a filing system, or maybe it's purging some of the files that you have. So throughout today's workshop, I really want you to think about that goal. And what I would really appreciate is if you would put some questions in the chat related to that goal. And as we get to the end of the webinar, we'll have some opportunities to kind of do some back and forth and maybe throw around some ideas of how to tackle that goal that you have set for yourself. So the first thing that comes to mind for me, and the first question I like to ask people when they say, why are we keeping records? How do I improve my record keeping system? So the first thing is, what are you keeping records for? Most of the time, the answer is taxes. Then I will get something related to regulations. And the third one is hopefully decision making. And so as we kind of think about that hierarchy of why, there's some very specific things that we can do in number one and number two that we have to keep. And then as we get to number three, and that decision-making role, that's where I would really like to see our farms and ranches head, is to that point where the filing system and the record-keeping system are working together so that you can create that opportunity to make decisions, and you don't have to work as hard, right? There's still work, but we can separate and move out that work. So let's continue on. If the primary focus of our paper management system is for tax purposes, I actually like to build the filing system around tax categories or tax line items. So here is the Schedule F. This is the report where we report farm income and expenses every year. And I like to think about having a place where I'm going to keep all of these kinds of information. So if we go to part 1 and we look under farm income, do I have livestock sales? How am I keeping those records? Am I getting that bill of sale from the livestock barn, or am I doing that based on invoices? And so what I would do is go down the line and look through and say, do you have this? Yes or no? How are those documents being stored? And in some ways, I actually like to almost see files around or segments around each of these areas. So we need to know exactly what we're looking for. This part 2 looks at farm expenses. And again, not every operation is going to have all of these expense categories, but do know that if you do have that, we're going to have to collect documentation related to that. If you're not familiar with a Schedule F, I really encourage you to look at the Farmer's Tax Guide, and the web address is there at the bottom of your screen. And also Nebraska Extension receives hundreds of these every year. And so we're happy to help you locate a paper copy, a hard copy of one of those. If you haven't ever read this document, I would really encourage you to do so. So not only does it go over the income and expenses, but it gives a little description of each of these line items and what can be included as a deductible expense or as income under each of these tax categories that we're discussing. So really would encourage you, if you're just getting started, brand new farm, a document that you should read is that Farmer's Tax Guide to help you kind of start to formulate what all kind of information do I need and how can we organize it. So along with that is then supporting documents for those tax deductions. And I will start right now by saying I am not a tax accountant, and I'm definitely not your tax accountant. And so if there are specific questions like, can I deduct this item, refer to the Farmer's Tax Guide, but then also refer to your tax accountant for those little innuendos, those, you know, I bought this item, is it tax deductible? That's for them to answer, not for someone like me. However, when I talk about record keeping, I think it's really important to think about what the IRS says the documentation needs to be. So from the income side, it says that your income documentation should show the amounts and the sources of your gross receipts. So again, if I'm selling animals at the sale barn, how many head, what were they, how much did they bring? Income, I think, is a little bit easier. Expenses is where it gets a little bit more detailed. And so so when we, excuse me, let me back up. So when we are retaining records for tax deductions related to our expenses, it should identify the payee, who we paid, the amount we paid, how we paid, the date that it was incurred, and a description of the item or service. So those are the kinds of details that we need. So one thing I see a lot of folks say is, well, one way to simplify my record keeping system is just to eliminate all of the receipts that I get, especially for credit cards. And if we think about what the IRS is asking us to provide, frankly, credit card receipts alone are not enough unless you have a specialized card like a Voyager card that provides that electronic receipt to you, or a fleet management card that does that. So just ignoring all of the receipts is not a good way to simplify your record keeping system. Okay, so we do need to retain copies of those items, and we'll talk about how long we need to keep each of these kinds of items. But this is my first tip, that bank and credit card statements are not enough for tax purposes. So you are going to need to retain some of that information. Now, somebody in the chat already asked electronic storage versus paper filing. And I think to some extent that's a personal preference on what you prefer and what you think you can manage. Some people are fully electronic, others retain those paper copies. And I think that's a personal choice. But I will be adding more details on, if we're going to look at a digital record keeping system, how we can name and file and identify those digital documents. And then also, one of the things with electronic systems is multiple formats and in safe spaces. So we'll talk about that a little bit more later. So when I talk about files, or as we go through today, they don't necessarily have to be folders. I think sometimes like we automatically go, okay, I need a giant filing cabinet and a bunch of folders. And I don't think that's necessarily true. I have seen lots of systems that use shoe boxes and boot boxes. Those are probably the most common. I also see bank boxes with the folders in them. I've seen accordion folders. I've even seen Ziploc bags full of documents that work just fine, or those digital files that we discussed earlier. So you can think outside of the box and see what works best for you in terms of collecting and storing those items. I think about files kind of in 4 sections. And my first section are what I'm going to call active files. These are files that are going to be in my office every day, that on a fairly regular basis I'm going to get into. My next set of files are the current year files. So items that I've already done some organization or management of that need to be kind of within arm's reach but aren't ready for long-term storage. Number 3 is that long-term storage piece, and I call that on file, which means they can be in a filing cabinet a little bit of ways away. I'm probably not going to get into them unless I need to reference something specific. And then there's also the non-farm files. And as much as I would love to say that this is, it's easy to distinguish between the two, we still probably need to also manage, if we're dealing with the operations files, we also need to deal with our family files as well. So that's section 4. So again, there's 4 sections there. This is just how I think about it. And I'm going to be walking through each of these sections and providing tips and ideas in each of these sections. So the first one is active files. Okay. And again, it does not have to be in a folder. And you'll see that a couple of these items might be a folder or might not. So the first one is some sort of ledger of accounts. So for the bulk of farms and ranches that I see today, you probably have a check register and some sort of accounting software. You might have a handwritten ledger, but it's really important that ledger or that register of accounts is available somewhere easily at hand. The next are items such as checks and cash for deposit. Pretty straightforward items that just need to be taken care of. 3 is unpaid bills and invoices, right? Things that need to be handled. 4 is unreconciled documents. And 5 is documents without enough information in them. So these are my active files. So here's how I like to visualize this. I'm going to create some sort of inbox. Okay, and again, this is going to be a location where those items come into. It doesn't necessarily have to be in the office. It doesn't necessarily have to be an inbox like you see on the screen. It could be a giant tote out in the shed, somewhere convenient that people can put all of that paperwork into, whether that's an invoice or receipt. All of that goes into the inbox to be handled. Stays in that inbox. We clean it out on a fairly regular basis. And I'm going to then utilize the check register and or account ledger to record that information. I'm going to mail off those bills that need to be paid. I'm just going to go ahead and do that. And then I'm going to have an envelope for the items that need to be deposited. Then I'm going to create 3 files that are going to be in a secured drawer. Those are going to be unpaid bills and invoices. So let's say for whatever reason, maybe the due date's not for another 30 days. So I'm going to stick those into a specific file of unpaid bills and invoices. The next one is unreconciled documents. So these are my bank statements and my receipts that I have not reconciled yet. And you know, this folder might be a little big. And the last one, and one that I really encourage you to create, is the needs more information file. So inevitably, when you run across something, it's not going to have all the information you need to enter it into your ledger or pay the bill. So we'll talk about it here in a little bit, but I actually put these in a red folder of they're my problem children that I need to deal with, but I'm not going to waste my time doing that right now. So they go in the needs more information file. So when we start talking about managing our paper trail, the first thing is that you need to set aside time. Okay, this is not necessarily the funnest task on the operation. So I encourage you to set aside some time every day or every week to do this task. Now, I have a friend and she has a really big garden, and it's always so beautiful. And I say, how do you keep all the weeds out of your garden? And she says, I never weed my garden more than 20 minutes a day. So she sets a clock for 20 minutes, and that's her time to weed the garden. And when the 20 minutes is up, she's done. And that's how she keeps up on it. And so thinking about that in terms of records, using some sort of system like that allows you to do a little bit every day, rather than trying to do it all at once, might be really helpful. So that's something that you can consider. 15, 20 minutes, and maybe your operation could do 15 or 20 minutes a week. But I see a lot of people that wait until the end of the year to try to do all of their paperwork, filing and reconciling, and it just makes the task so unbearable that I would really encourage you to set aside time on a regular basis to tackle these tasks. Here's another one: keep your business and your personal separate. I think this is just good business sense of keeping the personal items and the business items separate. So that inbox that you create should be an inbox for farm and ranch items. It should not be the dumping ground of all the mail that comes in. So even if we create, two inboxes, one for personal or the home and one for the operation, I think that's really important. And we start that split at the beginning. If you do not have split finances already, I would really encourage you to do that, just so that we're able to identify the difference between what's a farm expense and what's a personal expense. And I would talk to your banker and your tax accountant about how to do that properly. So along with that, I think some of the consternation with record keeping comes from the fact that personal items get put on the farm credit card and farm items get put on the personal credit card. So I would actually encourage you to think about color coding to some extent, credit cards, checkbook covers, and folders if you're managing your operation next to your personal. So I know the red credit card is the farm and the blue credit card is the personal. They have red and blue checkbook covers, and we have red and blue files. So just a visual way to separate that out. So when you go to pull it out of your wallet, you can say to yourself, yes, this is the ranch credit card, or this is the personal credit card. So just a tip that I think that can be helpful. I've talked a little bit about inboxes, but I think inboxes are the key to success. And inboxes, like I said, don't necessarily have to even be in the office. They can be anywhere. And so that little ugly brown folder is called a check folder, and you can pick them up at any office supply store, and they fit really well down into the doors of pickups and equipment. So again, if I place that in the pickup, that's the inbox. That's where you're going to turn in all the receipts when you're out running around. And then, one of my time slots, one day a week, I'll go around and I'll pick up all the receipts out of that. Another thing that works is shoe boxes on top of the washing machine, or an inbox on the kitchen table of things that need to be dealt with for the farm or the ranch. So think about what would work in terms of an inbox, what's the best way for me to set up an inbox, and then what will actually get used. All right, my next tip for you is don't wait to organize. If nothing else, in the time that you set aside on a daily or a weekly basis, flatten out those receipts so that they're nice and easy to handle. There's nothing worse than opening up that shoebox, right, and seeing just like crumpled up, nasty receipts, right? It's one of those things that's easy to do that will make them easier to handle as you work through reconciling and filing, is if from the very beginning we get them flattened out and we get them into a nice pile. Another thing that really helps, especially with receipts and invoices, is to write notes on them. Okay, so again, I've got them in a nice pile here, and let's say I went to the local parts store. I'm probably going to write the tax category on it. So I'm going to write repairs on it. And then maybe we're working on doing some separation in our accounting for each piece of equipment. So I might write the equipment name on it. Or if I have a landlord, maybe, or a farm name, I can write that on that receipt as well. I think that really helps, especially if you have one person who is purchasing the item and another person who is actually entering those items into a software, or you're expecting them to organize that for tax purposes. And having those notes on them really help that process go a little bit quicker. So I think that's something that really can make a big difference, and it helps you learn. So we used to write a lot of notes on our receipts, and more I can kind of figure out what things are. But it's really helpful, especially at minimum, I would write the tax category on them. On invoices, again, the tax category is useful, whether or not it has been paid and the check number or how it was paid. So on invoices, I really like to write paid, the date, and whether it was a check number or a credit card, so that I know that was handled and I can kind of reconcile those items together. All right. This next one is for you digital folks, and it is use email or cloud storage. So on our operation, we're still a paper and pen kind of people, but I do see operations wanting to use email or cloud storage. And so what they do is they set up a separate email account that will take snapshots of the receipts. So instead of putting them into the inbox, they will snap a photograph of that receipt and email it to whatever email address they've set up. One of the concerns about this is the security of the system. So if you're going to subscribe to a cloud storage system, just making sure that you're not including sensitive information, social security numbers, account numbers, those kinds of things. It's probably okay for your everyday receipts. Now, I will say the IRS will accept digital copies of documents. So if this is the route that you want to go, you don't have to retain the paper copy. You can just have the digital version. But again, think about the safety and security of that document and whether it's okay if it gets hacked. All right. This is one of my favorite tips, and that is know what to throw. A lot of times, when we get an invoice or we get a bank statement, it comes with a bunch of extras. They throw in an extra envelope, they throw in a pamphlet, they throw in all sorts of stuff. And knowing what to discard right from the beginning can be really helpful. And so make sure that you discard the right things and get rid of those extras from the beginning as we open that mail or we're looking through our documents. All right, I talked about this a little bit, and the red folder. Get you a nice red folder for your problem children. So for those receipts that don't have a tax category written on them, or an invoice, you don't know whether it's been paid or not, they go into the red folder. And so it's just a place to put them to remind you that you need to take care of them, but they're not going to hinder your progress for the day. So I really like having kind of a red folder system that says this is the document that I need to work on, but I just need to put it somewhere for right now so that I can finish out my 20 minutes today strong. And then my next 20-minute segment, I'm going to go track down that person or make that phone call to figure out what's up with that document and how we can utilize it or correct it so that I've got the information I need to either put it in the software or pay the bill. All right. My next tip is to keep an updated check register. This is like such a lost art for most farms and ranches. In my mind, there's really no point in keeping a check register if it's not up to date. And I actually kind of like a 2-line system to kind of back up what I'm going to be putting in my digital accounting software. So again, on the screen, you can see the 2-line setup. So on the top, I'm going to just have the payee and the amount paid, right? Which is what most people get. And I'm also going to have the balance, which like 50-50 shot whether people actually track their balance of the checkbooks that I've seen recently. And then the next line, what you can do is write in the tax category and the memo. And so this kind of helps us again, especially if you have one person writing the checks and one person entering or reconciling this information, just helps them learn more and know exactly what to do with that check and how to categorize it. So you can see check number 233 was written on June 28th to the local farm store. Okay. And I would probably know that that's farm supplies, but it could also be repairs. It could also be fuel and oil. It could be a whole ton of different things, especially if you're, you have like a one-stop shop farm store. But here we can see that they want it categorized as supplies and that was some sort of fencing material that they had purchased. So a 2-line check register can be helpful, but again, you gotta, if you're gonna do it, like you gotta commit to it. So that might be something that helps, is just getting more details within that check register. This is especially important if you don't retain carbon copies of your checks or you don't receive scanned copies of your checks from your bank. That's 2 other tips that I would probably add. I like a carbon copy and I like to see the scan of the check within my bank documents as well. So if I have those 2 items, maybe the check register is not important, but if I don't, the check register becomes much, much more important as I move forward. So I've talked a little bit about digital record keeping software, and I personally use a digital record keeping software program, and the program can print your checks for you. I think it's probably a little bit underutilized, but I think it is an opportunity. Most softwares, what they do is they allow you to enter the transaction and then print the check. So instead of me handwriting the check and then typing in the transaction, I can now kind of do it in one foul swoop. So depending on the number of checks that you're writing in your operation, this can be really useful. So that's something that if you're inclined to do, I think can be very helpful. That way, it's not floating everywhere. You could almost eliminate a checkbook to some extent if you were able to print off of your computer. I would have a checkbook for backups or emergencies, but moving to printing most of the checks out of the financial software can be helpful. Make notes of production activities on a calendar. And I think this is important because we forget things. So I think it's really nice to just put, started bean planting or started calving. And that way, when I get a receipt that comes in, I kind of have a little bit more of an idea of what it was for. And I think it's just kind of fun to keep track of kind of what season that was in. So a good example of this, again, is going to that farm supply store. Well, if we started calving, I'm probably getting calving supplies while I'm at the store. So just kind of, hey, this was kind of the date range. This is what we were doing. Do you remember going and doing this? What did you buy? I can't find the receipt for it. I need to categorize it. Let's figure it out. Okay. So having that calendar on the wall that just makes notes of production is important. And then on this one, consider the ease of access to your documents. And I think this is a double-edged sword, because I want my documents to be easy for me to access them, but I don't want any Joe Schmo just to be able to walk into my farm office and be able to see social security numbers, birth dates, and account numbers. So we need to think about the security, which I'm going to talk a little bit more on the next slide. But I'm going to keep documents that I need access to pretty close at hand. And then the documents that I don't need access to on a regular basis, those longer term documents, I'm going to keep them a little bit farther away. But what am I going to get into on a consistent basis? That needs to be at the desk, and the rest can then be in storage. So secure your documents. Again, this goes for both paper and digital documents. So those documents we're going to have on hand, the checkbook, the unpaid bills and invoices, the unreconciled items, undeposited checks and cash, that all probably needs to be in a locking filing cabinet, just because there's so much personal information that's included in those documents. So I really like to see folks have at least one locking drawer where that information is kept. We've talked a little bit about digital records in terms of security on cloud-based or email-based systems, but also having a backup file. So I don't just want it saved to the computer, it needs to be on a USB or it needs to be in the cloud. And again, we need to consider the sensitive nature of the information. If you're going to be disposing documents that have account numbers, social security numbers, birth dates, etc., you need to get a shredder and you need to shred those documents. So when you're going through, maybe you're purging some items, really think about what does this have on it, and potentially just shredding those to ensure that they don't fall into the wrong hands. You'll see in the center of the screen that there's a fireproof safe there. And there are certain documents that need that higher security. And I think it's really important to think about fireproof as well. There's certain parts of the states that have been through fires, but especially things like passports, marriage certificates, titles, those kinds of things. If they're going to be in the house, they need to be very, very secure. The other thing is bank security boxes. Bank safety deposit boxes. Maybe some of those items shouldn't be on your property. Maybe they should be even more secure in something like that. All right, so I'm going to move from active files to current year. But before I do that, I'm going to check the chat. Any questions about kind of that active filing first step? If you have a question, you can type it in the chat or put it in the Q&A. Either is fine. I'm happy to answer those. Okay, I'm not seeing anything come through, but if you have questions, just throw them out and I'll answer those as we go along. So there is a physical action that moves our files from an active file to a current year. So again, kind of putting it in a little bit, it's been organized, it's been reconciled. So items will remain active until they are paid, deposited, or reconciled. And reconciliation, again, is another one of those lost arts. If I can instill anything with you today, it's please, please, please reconcile your files. So the reconciling is the process of making sure that a record of the financial account is consistent with another. So basically what we're going to be doing most of the time is comparing our monthly bank statements to our receipts. Then we're going to compare either our check register or our accounting software to those receipts to make sure they're correct, and making sure that the balance on the monthly bank statement and the check register are together. And if they're not perfect, let's say we deposited a check and it didn't show up on the bank statement, I'm going to include a reconciliation worksheet that shows either this check has not cleared the bank as a deposit, or it hasn't cleared the bank as a withdrawal. And so we'll need to continue that documentation. Tina Barrett at Nebraska Farm Business Incorporated has a great story of a feedlot that paid a bill and somebody else ended up depositing it. I think is how that worked. So even though banking is much better than it used to be in terms of accuracy and speed, there still are possibilities for there to be errors. And if you don't reconcile your documents, you're not going to catch those errors. And then I think it also makes you a little bit more aware of what's going on. So as we set aside time for our record keeping system, one thing that you do need to do when you receive your bank statements is to reconcile on a monthly basis. So this is when your 20 or 30 minutes that you're setting aside is dedicated to a specific task. And if you're reconciling on a fairly regular basis, you should get pretty fast at it. And the accounting softwares like Quicken and QuickBooks actually have reconciling features that make it much, much faster and easier. So reconcile those documents on a monthly basis. That also means that you have to have your receipts all collected from your inboxes on a monthly basis and kind of straightened out and ready to go. All right, so we're moving from active files to current year files. So again, these files don't need to be as accessible, but still do need some security. All right, so here's my list of current year documents. And I'm actually going to be providing a handout with the posting and with the email that goes into greater detail about these documents. So reconciled documents, reconciled receipts, basically, is going to be one, your monthly and quarterly financial statements, your current balance sheet, cash flow, and loan guarantee documents, current supporting your tax documents. So for example, if you get a W-9 or a W-2 or a D-pad, whatever that is, some of those tax forms that you get, copies of documents submitted to USDA. I think this is more important now that our USDA offices aren't currently accepting walk-in traffic. I think it's a little bit easier to have documents kind of lost in the shuffle. So I've added that. Anything you turn in, just keep a copy of it. Inventory of supplies, what do you have on hand? Livestock production records. This particularly is important for beef quality assurance, and then crop production records, and there's some regulations regarding restricted use pesticides. So I don't have a lot to say on production records. We could do a whole nother webinar on production records alone, but I will say if you have questions about the reporting or documentation requirements for beef quality assurance, I recommend that you look at their BQA field guide, and on page 24, it goes through what types of information you are supposed to retain. And then if you're here in Nebraska, the Nebraska Department of Ag has a pesticide record keeping information article at that website as well. So again, there's probably a lot more in terms of regulation that you need to be aware of, but these are the two that I get asked the most about when we start talking about production records. All right, so as we move to current files, we have to then actually build a filing system. Up until this point, we've kind of just been organizing. Now we have to dedicate ourselves to how we're going to file. So I think about files at a minimum, there's two levels of organization. The first level is the file, and the second level is the organization within the file. So there's kind of three options under each of these. So they can be chronological by year or by month, alphabetical by entity, or alphabetical by Schedule F tax line item. So that's how I'm going to decide what labels I'm going to put on the files. And then depending on what I do there, I then get to decide, again, chronological by date or alphabetical by entity, chronological by date, or alphabetical by entity. So we'll see how this all plays out. And I think it feels a little confusing, but here's the example, okay? you need to find a receipt for diesel fuel purchased from your local convenience store on July 14th. What's the easiest way for you to find it? You might ask this question or think about how this question has been posed in your operation. Okay, so option one would be to file it by July, and then either by the date or by the convenience store. Option two would be to file it by the convenience store and then by the date. Or option three would be to file it under Schedule F and then either chronological or alphabetical. Okay. Ask yourself what makes the most sense to you and how somebody else is going to ask you. So if somebody asks me on our farm, hey, do you have that receipt for ABC convenience store on July 14th? I'm probably going to pick option B just because that makes the most sense to me. But I have seen filing systems in kind of all three ways. They work perfectly fine, but you need to pick a way and stick to it. Okay, so this is where kind of the rubber starts to hit the road of you need to make a decision about what's easiest for you. And maybe your operation isn't so big that every single one of these needs to be an individual file. Maybe you have expenses in one folder with dividers that are A, B, C, D, E, and then chronological within the dividers. Okay, so, but you need to really think about this process and how people ask questions about the files or about the documents and what's the easiest way to get to that information. And this also is the same for when you're doing digital records. So what's the easiest way to find this? Can I create a folder that's ABC convenience store and then the receipt is the date name? Or is it easier to put July and then the date and ABC convenience store? I don't know, but you need to figure that out. But this filing system can work also when you're thinking about naming and designing your digital files as well. All right. I only like to add levels of complexity to my filing system when it's necessary. And the way that we add complexity is different drawers, different cabinets, or different colored folders. And I would say probably the one thing that I would say, yes, add that complexity absolutely for, is when you're working with multiple entities or businesses that require separate accounting. So that's when I would add, this is the LLC drawer, this is the partnership drawer, or something like that, or this is one LLC and this is another LLC. Again, visually breaking that up a little bit. Or again, if we're talking about color coding, the yellow credit card is the LLC, the green credit card is the family, the yellow folders are the LLC, the green folders are the family. So just kind of thinking about creating that consistency throughout. Okay. So, but again, if you don't need to add complexity, do not do it, right? Start as simple as possible when you're building your actual filing system. And I said this before, but consistency is key. We're building our filing system with those current year files, and it's really important that we figure out how we want it to be filed and we stick to it, at least for that production or that tax reporting year. We're going to try it this way for a year, and if we like it, we'll keep it, but next year maybe we'll make that amendment next year, but don't try to change it halfway through the year. Okay. That way that this year was filed a certain way. So if you're inheriting a filing system, I think this is important too. Don't try to change in the middle of the year. Okay. So if you're inheriting a filing system, that's all filed and done. Okay. But moving forward, this is how we're going to file. And again, I like to use it by calendar years for tax reporting purposes. All right. Again, if you have any questions, you're welcome to throw them in the chat or in the Q&A, but we're going to move on to on-file documents. So we have moved out of the current year, we're going to kind of close that out and we're going to move them into longer term storage. So these are on file documents that I should keep for a little while. The first is past tax documents. Any entity information, a list of accounts, credit cards, lines of credit, accounts payable, any farm or ranch related insurance policies, employee, custom hire, or contractor information, a list of assets, real estate, vehicles, equipment, and machinery, and a list of accounts receivable. On-file documents to me are extremely important, not only just from like a record keeping standpoint, but from an estate planning standpoint. So if you're the record keeper for your farm or your ranch, if something happens to you, where's all the information related to what's happening? And I think that's hard to think about. Like, heaven forbid something happens to me today. Can somebody else walk into this office and know what's up and know where we're at, what's been paid, what hasn't? And so I think it's really important, especially the on-file documents, we should take some care with in terms of labels and organization and thinking through what all needs to be there. If somebody needed to come in and take over this office, you know, can they do that and know where things are? Somebody asked, I'm starting a system that maintains all receipts for 1 year. Is that too simple? No, I think starting as simple as possible is important. So even as we think through moving into kind of these more longer term files that we're retaining, trying to keep the simplest format as possible is encouraged. Yeah, thinking through, I've seen people with accordion folders that just do things. This is 1 year and it has 12 slots. If you can fit it all in one accordion folder for 1 year, that's great. That's totally awesome. I think more about more complex operations, feedlots, hay sales, bull sales, cow sales. I mean, that really expands just the sheer amount of paperwork with it. And so that's when I start to think about greater complexity. But again, if you can just start as simple as possible, I think that's, especially if you're able to start fresh, I think that's probably my favorite way to start, is just start little and then expand. Okay. So as we go into these longer term documents, we get back into the comment of know what to throw. And that's that different documents have different lifespans. My next slide, I'm going to show you those different lifespans. This is by no means an all-encompassing slide. I'm sure you guys have recommendations or questions about other document types, but these are the ones that I get asked about the most. So here we go. Permanent documents. Permanent documents are tax returns. So not necessarily all the receipts that go with it, but the actual return. So every farm or ranch should have all of their tax returns from their inception to now in a permanent file. The next one is legal filings, such as entity documents. So if you're in a partnership and there's a partnership agreement, there should be a file that's kept forever that has that partnership agreement in it. Also, your lawyer should have a copy of that, but we know that it's always good to have more than one. All right. The next one is proof of asset tax basis for your tax basis. So especially for machinery, equipment, those kinds of things, and land, probably more than anything, we need to know or have proof of the purchase price, any improvements or depreciation for especially land, so that we've got an idea of what our asset tax basis is. So that can be something that we work through. My next column is it depends, just because they have different lifespans. So warranties, again, I'm probably going to keep the warranty document, the registration, and the proof of purchase for that item within some sort of warranty folder. loan documents, depending on the length of the loan, and lease agreements, depending on the length of the lease. Production items need to be kept for 2 to 3 years. So the restricted use pesticide information needs to be kept for 3 years. And then on livestock production, pesticides used on livestock also need to be kept for 3 years, but herd health records only need to be kept for 2 years. And then the big boy. The big boy is the receipts for tax deductions. So the IRS has a 3 to 7 year period. So we need to keep those receipts and invoices, the proof of payments, etc., for 3 to 7 years. So we need a record of income or deductible expenses, and they can look back up to 7. And then employment records, including payroll and earnings, for up to 4 years from when the taxes are due or paid, whichever is later. Okay. So that is something, like I said, I could probably expand out, but I think it's important that you know what to keep and for how long. I don't think there's any hurt in keeping things longer unless like you're running out of space. But again, knowing that I need to pull that physical return document and keep it permanently, but I can discard those receipts at that time, that can be helpful. So there is a question in the Q&A that says, is it important to have your own electronic or paper copy of insurance policies if you normally access them on your insurer's website? And I would say yes. I think it's always important, especially let's say it's a farm liability policy, to have that on hand, just so that you know what you agreed to at the beginning. Websites can be changed, links can be broken. So I would like to see that you retain that either as an electronic file or as a hard copy. Again, if you have questions, please go ahead and stick them in the chat. We only have a few more minutes together, about 8 minutes, and I'd love to answer your questions as I wrap up here with my final slides. So the next tip that I have for you, especially when we get into long-term storage, is your goal for long-term storage should be preserving the quality of the document. So it does us no good to have 7 years worth of receipts if they are crumpled up, nasty, can't read, gross receipts. Like there's no point in that. So as you think about long-term storage of documents, if you think about that 7-year period or that permanent retention, we need to think about, again, is it laying flat? Is it easy to read? I know that receipts naturally fade. That might be a reason why you go maybe to a digital setup, particularly with receipts, but there's no point for them to be wadded up, wet, moldy, torn into pieces, eaten by mice. If you're not going to retain them properly, I don't see the point. So as you think about long-term storage, think about preserving the quality of that document. Okay, here's a fun one. And this kind of gets into the non-farm files or non-ranch files, but I think these kind of go hand in hand, because I think sometimes that paper management, right? We've only got one filing cabinet or one area where all these documents are at. And again, at the beginning, I said we need to split this out, but that also means that we need to create some space and some thought process into our family records as well. So the first, this is just a brief list of the items that I see that fall kind of into non-farm or non-operation records. Any government issued documents that pertain to your family and not to your operation. Marriage licenses, personal titles, those kinds of things. Military discharge papers, those things. Estate planning documents. You need to have a location where your estate documents are. And again, this could be with a lawyer. It could be at the bank in a security box, but it needs to be somewhere. Okay, so if something happens to you, go to this drawer or go to this safe or whatever that is, have a location where those documents are at. My next one is other official records, and that would include like college transcripts, any medical records that you may have, any vaccination records that you may have, some of those items that you should have for each individual family member. And then you need a list of your personal assets and debts, just like we did a list for the farm or the ranch. Again, if I pass away, do they know that I owe somebody such and such money? It makes it a lot easier for your executor. And then I also like to keep a list of key people. Okay, so let's say I own land, who does my custom operations, or who is the current tenant, or who is my doctor? Those kinds of things can also be important as we look at kind of our family records. And again, know what to throw. I mean, there's some things you need and there's some things that you don't. But again, be careful of how you handle these personal use documents. They might have some sensitive information on them. So you can, again, get a shredder if you feel like you no longer need that document, and make sure that if it does have sensitive information, that it has been shredded. All right, so some tax accountants disagree with me on this, but I don't see the point in retaining receipts, deposit slips, etc. once my bank statement has been reconciled, with the exceptions of warranties and returns. So I might retain my receipts for like 90 days. That gives me enough time to double check with the bank statement and that everything has been reconciled and is proper and is posted, and that I don't want to return that item. The only other thing is if I'm going to itemize on a personal level, and with the current tax law, it's a pretty high threshold that you have to get to itemize. So I don't think nearly as many Americans are itemizing at this point. So I did include a list of what can be itemized and deducted if you are able to itemize, but most Americans at this point are not. So I actually don't retain those receipts and stuff beyond the warranty or return period for my personal information. Now for the farm, because we have to list that all on the Schedule F, that all gets retained for the 7-year period. Talked a little bit about this. Don't be the only one who knows where your items are at, but also don't be the only person who knows the password or has the keys or knows where the keys to all your filing cabinets and stuff are at. There should be a part of your estate plan that your executor knows. If you have a financial software for your farm or your ranch, they know the password to get into that software. One of the first years I was teaching record keeping here at UNL, I had a family come in, and mom was the record keeper, and she passed away, and everything was so secure they couldn't get into it. They didn't have her passwords. They didn't have that information. And so we literally rebuilt their farm records so that they could file their taxes that fall. And it was hard. It was hard because they were grieving, and they knew that she was an exceptional accountant or a record keeper and had all of that done. And we had to go through and redo it so that they could submit it. And so please, as a part of your plan, let your executor know the passwords and where keys are. All right, so at the beginning of today's workshop, I asked you to write down one paper-related goal. And now I want you to write down 2 or 3 things that we talked about today that you can do or change to accomplish this goal. And also, if you have any questions, I would take any questions from the chat or the Q&A. But I'm going to let you write down those 2 or 3 items that you can do to obtain that goal. All right, well, that's the end of today's presentation. I'm going to hang out for a little bit to answer any questions. If you have questions, maybe you don't feel like leaving them in the chat, you are more than welcome to contact me. My contact information is on the screen. I am located out in Scottsbluff, but I travel the state quite a bit, and I would love to chat with you about your record keeping system. I would also let you know that we put the survey for today's talk in the chat box if you would also complete that survey. While I am not seeing any questions coming across the chat box or the Q&A, I would encourage you to check us out next week for our regularly scheduled Thursday webinar. Otherwise, I will see you all next time. Thank you.